China quietly sold $600 billion in US debt while you weren't looking.
Beijing is grappling with a mounting debt crisis. $54 trillion at the end of 2022.
This is the story of a huge change in the Chinese economy.
Unrest is growing in China. Fresh protests have broken out in major cities with hundreds rallying, chanting.
From a peak of $1.3 trillion in 2013 to just $700 billion in 2025, that's a 46% reduction. $600 billion in Treasury bonds, dumped, sold, weaponized. And this isn't an investment decision. This is financial warfare. While the US imposed tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese imports, China responded with 125% tariffs on American goods. But the real retaliation? Quietly destabilizing the Treasury market by becoming the largest seller of US debt in history. This is how China is weaponizing your Treasury bonds, and they're winning. Let's understand what China actually did. In 2013, China held $1.3 trillion in US Treasury bonds. They were the largest foreign holder of American debt. The US owed China more than any other country. By 2024, that number dropped to $772 billion. By 2025, $700 billion. That's a $600 billion reduction in 12 years. But this wasn't a panic sell. This wasn't a crash. This was deliberate, strategic, and devastatingly effective. China sold slowly enough to avoid crashing the market immediately, but fast enough to send a message. We're not trapped like Japan. We can leave. And we are leaving. Every month, China sold a few billion here, a few billion there. Quiet, methodical, no announcements, no press releases. Just steady selling that forced the US Treasury market to absorb billions in supply without American policymakers even noticing until it was too late. Now let's connect the dots. This $600 billion dump didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during the escalation of the US-China trade war. 2018, Trump administration imposes first round of tariffs on Chinese goods.
Is striking back. In just the last hour, Beijing announced it is now slapping new retaliatory tariffs on all U.S. goods by an additional 50%.
China's Treasury holdings start declining faster. 2019, tariffs escalate. China holds $1.1 trillion, down from $1.3 trillion. 2020 to 2022. Trade tensions continue. China keeps selling.
China.
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 2024, US imposes tariffs up to 145% on Chinese imports. China responds with 125% tariffs on American goods. China's Treasury holdings dropped to $772 billion. 2025, $700 billion. The selling accelerates. The correlation is undeniable. As trade relations deteriorated, China weaponized their Treasury holdings, not by dumping everything at once and causing a crisis, but by slowly strangling the Treasury market, forcing the US to find other buyers, driving up borrowing costs. It's financial warfare, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. So where did China's $600 billion go? They didn't just sell and hold cash. They diversified into weapons against dollar hegemony. Gold. China became the world's largest gold buyer, accumulating thousands of tons of physical gold stored in Chinese vaults. Gold doesn't depend on US solvency. It's the anti-dollar asset. Belt and road infrastructure. China invested hundreds of billions building ports, roads, and railways across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Physical assets generating returns and geopolitical influence. Currency swap agreements. China established bilateral currency swaps with dozens of countries, allowing trade without using dollars, slowly building a parallel financial system. Other sovereign bonds. Chinese reserves diversified into European bonds, Japanese bonds, anything that isn't Treasury bonds. The goal isn't just to exit US debt, it's to build alternatives to the dollar-dominated system. China is constructing the infrastructure for a world where US Treasuries aren't the only safe haven. Here's what China's $600 billion sale actually did to the Treasury market. When the largest foreign buyer becomes a net seller, someone else has to absorb that supply. Who stepped in? The Federal Reserve. They had to buy treasuries to stabilize the market. American taxpayers essentially buying back debt from China through central bank operations. Interest rates also felt the pressure. With less foreign demand, treasury yields had to rise to attract new buyers. Higher yields mean higher government borrowing costs. China's selling forced the US to pay more to borrow money. Over 12 years, this added hundreds of billions in extra interest payments. China sold at high prices early on. The US now has to refinance at higher rates. China profited on the exit while making American debt more expensive. It's brilliant, diabolical, and completely legal. Remember Japan's trap? They hold $1.18 trillion and can't sell without destroying their own investment. Why can China escape when Japan can't? Geopolitical independence. Japan is a US military ally dependent on American protection. China is a rival power that doesn't need American approval. Economic structure. Japan runs trade surpluses that generate dollars needing investment. China has been rebalancing toward domestic consumption, generating fewer dollar reserves to invest. Strategic patience. China planned their exit over 12 years, slow enough to avoid triggering panic, fast enough to reduce exposure before a potential crisis. Alternative systems. China built Belt and Road, currency swaps, and gold reserves. They created alternatives before exiting. Japan hasn't. China saw the treasury trap and escaped. Japan is still inside. The trade war gave China cover for financial warfare. The US imposed 145% tariffs. China responded with 125% tariffs. Everyone focused on the trade war. But the real retaliation was dumping $600 billion in treasuries. That's the equivalent of pulling hundreds of billions in financing from the US government, making American borrowing more expensive, forcing the Fed to intervene, destabilizing dollar hegemony. The tariffs make headlines. The treasury dump is invisible to most Americans. But financially, the treasury dump is far more damaging long term. Trade wars hurt specific industries. Financial wars undermine the entire system. And China is fighting the financial war while America focuses on the trade war. For decades, the US used the dollar as a weapon. Sanctions, frozen assets, swift system control. Any country that crossed America faced financial punishment through dollar dominance. China watched this and realized dependence on dollars is a vulnerability. So they spent 12 years reducing that vulnerability. Selling treasuries, buying gold, building alternative payment systems, creating a financial architecture that doesn't require dollars. Now, when the US threatens sanctions, China has options. They're not as exposed to dollar-based punishment. They can operate outside the dollar system more easily than any other major economy. The US weaponized the dollar for so long that China built weapons to fight back. And the primary weapon? Dumping US debt. Here's what should terrify US policymakers. China proved it's possible to escape the treasury trap, and other countries are watching. If more countries follow China's strategy, slowly selling treasuries, diversifying into alternatives, building parallel financial systems, who buys US debt? The US borrows trillions annually. If foreign buyers become net sellers, domestic buyers have to absorb that supply. That means higher interest rates, higher borrowing costs, more expensive debt service. China's $600 billion dump is a proof of concept. They showed it can be done. They showed there's life after treasury dependence. And now every country trapped in US debt is studying China's playbook. Project forward. China continues selling, down to $500 billion by 2027, $300 billion by 2030. Other countries follow. Saudi Arabia diversifies. South Korea reduces exposure. Even European allies start questioning treasury dependence. Foreign holdings of US debt drop from $8 trillion to $6 trillion. Then $5 trillion. The US has to find $3 trillion in new buyers domestically. Interest rates spike. The government pays $2 trillion annually just on interest, then $3 trillion. The debt spiral accelerates. The dollar's reserve status weakens. America's financial dominance erodes. All because China showed the way out and others followed. China sold $600 billion in US Treasury bonds over 12 years. From $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $700 billion in 2025. While the US focused on tariffs and trade wars, China fought a financial war. They escaped the treasury trap that holds Japan hostage. They diversified into gold, infrastructure, and alternative systems. They proved that dollar dependence can be overcome. And they did it quietly. No announcements, no drama. Just steady, strategic selling that destabilized the treasury market while building alternatives to dollar hegemony. The US imposed 145% tariffs. China responded with 125% tariffs. But the real revenge? Dumping $600 billion in debt and showing the world how to escape American financial control. This is financial warfare. And China isn't just fighting, they're winning. The question isn't whether other countries will follow China's strategy, it's when, and whether America's financial dominance can survive when they do.